Hi, everyone. Welcome to this event hosted by the European Federation for Science Journalists. My name is Olga Dobrovidova. I'm the founding for former vice president of the Federation and the facilitator of this current series of events on responsible science journalism and the technological solutions for the climate crisis, where we talk about the ways in which science journalists can interrogate various claims about the wonderful, interesting, compelling solutions science and technology offer for the current predicament that we're all in, the climate crisis. The first event in this series was a talk by Rebecca White, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism Fellow in November 2025. She introduced us to reporting on climate repair, which she used this term to refer both to CDR and geoengineering. I highly encourage you to check out the recording of that meeting, that webinar on the EFSJ website. And today we will zoom in on the carbon removal bit to talk a bit more about the feasible CDR, what is actually possible, what can be done, and how much of it can be realistically factored into national and global climate goals. We have a stellar lineup of speakers today, and we'll start with Dr. Nam Vaughan, Professor of Climate Change at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research at the University of East Anglia. She will talk about the physical and the sustainability limits to CDR. Nem, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And you should all be able to see my slides. Yep. Okay, I'm going to start my timer and try and hit 15 minutes tightly. Apologies in advance to those listening at double speed afterwards. I talk quite quickly. What I'm going to do, turns out I'm top of the billing today, so I'm going to give a super quick CDR just so everyone's on the same page. And then I'm going to present some of the latest, kind of where some of the most recent research is at on the sustainability limits questions. I'm then going to slip into feasibility of CDR, which is what I like to research. And just, I'm going to step through BECS actually, because it's a great example of the kind of complexity here. This here is the brief that I was given. I pulled these things out when I was invited. So hopefully you will leave with some inspiration for questions that might be worth asking for CDR methods, some of the limits or aspects to focus on when writing about a project, and a bit more of a more comprehensive picture, more critically. So carbon dioxide removal are activities that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it durably. We could have a separate debate about how to define durable, but you want it out of interaction with the atmosphere for a long time. There are three key features to doing this. The CO2 is getting captured from the air, and the captured CO2 is stored durably, and it is the direct result of human activity. We are not talking about emissions reduction, although sometimes different forms of CDR are very intimately kind of correlated to emissions reductions activity, particularly habitat restoration, but also some of the necessary bits of tech for engineered CDR. It takes place today. So I've got a nice picture on the right here for you of some tree planting in the English countryside. And at the bottom right, you've got the Mammoth project at Climeworks, direct air capture and storage plant in Iceland. The reason we're here today, and Rupert and Neil will pick up this thread in their talks, is the challenge of CDR being used at scale, right? At large scale in future emissions to limit the impacts of climate change. There are a huge diversity of types of CDR. They're at varying stages of development. A couple are still very much field trial. This is a classic image from the IPCC. There are a range of ways to capture the CO2. There are a range of ways to store them. One tries to speed up the natural land sink, one tries to speed up the ocean carbon sink, and the other is a kind of novel engineered store of carbon. I'm happy to answer questions on any of these methods. There is a bit of a split in the literature about nature-based and engineered. I'd argue that's not actually helpful when you're trying to be critical about the methods because there's a lot of overlap in the middle there. So I was asked to talk about sustainability limits. So here's a nice classic on the left image of sustainability limits, this idea of having a big theoretical potential and then having a smaller kind of technical or economic potential, and then the smallest sustainable. So obviously in this space with theoretical potential, we're usually focused on biophysical limits, like how much land is available to afforest or how much sedimentary basin storage capacity might there be to store carbon. The technical and the economic I've put together because they are two parts of a kind of tease with one another, but often framed around how much carbon can be removed and how much does it cost per ton of carbon? And there's a lot of capacity here for improvement and development over time. So that moves a lot, that one. In terms of sustainable potential, there's various definitions. Meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs is the classic. In terms of SDGs, it's often things interacting around climate action, water quality and quantity, energy access, and biodiversity on life and below water. Um, I want to change slides. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to minimize you because I keep getting distracted by my own face. There we go. I want to talk to you about some 5 pieces of recent research published in the last year, most of them, that are trying to get at different aspects of these sustainability limits. So this first piece of work by Matt Giddon and colleagues, rather than just looking at where is the sedimentary storage available to do CCS, which is needed for BECCS and DACs, they considered some other kind of risk considerations. That's the framing they took. Things like ruling out protected areas, mindful of exclusive economic zones, mindful of population centres, aware of the limits that the polar environment would implement in terms of actioning these things, seismic hazards and ocean depth. So their paper, there's links at the bottom, provides a kind of prudent geological storage. There's a range of people trying to update this storage number, but this is a nice example of trying to bring some of the sustainability limits and feasibility constraints into that picture. This piece on the right is from Ruben Prutz, who's worked with colleagues at the Tyndall Centre, Jeff Price and Rachel Warren. And what they've done here in this study is look at future scenarios of future climate change scenarios, particularly SSP2 2.6, and looked at where forests were planted in the top panel and where bioenergy crops were grown in the bottom panel, and then brought that together with the work that Rachel and Jeff do around biodiversity hotspots and biodiversity refugia. So where we protect biodiversity habitats, where habitats are particularly hotspots for biodiversity, but how under future climate change these shift, and so the suitability of those refugia also move. They move poleward and they move with elevation under future climate change. So in red, they've identified here in both plots where there's an antagonism there between the land for forests or bioenergy and directly coming up against these biodiversity constraints. And the bottom left is by Wang and colleagues, and this is another attempt to think about the land available for afforestation. They constrained their land availability considering the negative albedo impact of putting forests, particularly in the higher latitudes. They looked at water safeguards and again, like the Prutz paper, biodiversity safeguards. So the figure on the left there is a set of concentric circles. The outside is the Bastine 2019 paper, which estimates this amount of carbon can be removed by forests. Then you have the Griscom paper inside that doesn't make it all the way around the circle. Then Quinn 2024. And then this study has committed and achievable. And you can see their estimates are far, far smaller. So this is one of the main take homes for putting or considering sustainability limits, is that it tends to shrink these top kind of theoretical numbers, as you might think reflected in the Bastine paper there, down to something smaller. Their little kind of focal point there is thinking about which countries this would translate to. So there are 2 more I wanted to raise your attention to. It's Alexander Dupre's work, which was a piece in Science Policy Forum that tries to take the IPCC technical mitigation potentials. So they on the top panel is in bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. The bottom panel is afforestation, and these long but grey bars are the kind of lower to upper technical potential. And then what they've done here is try to layer in again a measure of risk, low, medium, high, and very high risks. They've tried to kind of contextualize this number and bring it down in terms of assessment of risk. And they looked at factors like biodiversity loss, food security, and indigenous rights. So really starting to expand what we mean by sustainability limits. And on the right here was a piece led by Matt Giddon and Stephanie Rowe that I'm a co-author on in State of CDR, Chapter 8. And we were trying to look at meeting not only the temperature targets under Paris, but also the wording under the Paris Agreement about sustainable development, which includes protecting biodiversity, reducing hunger, and increasing energy access to those without it. And the take-home message here on the panel is that they looked at 455 scenarios and then screened them for 4 metrics, not perfect metrics, it's difficult to do, but screened the 455 for whether or not they breached these other criteria that we were trying to capture sustainability in, and only 34 scenarios met those criteria. So trying to be mindful of the sustainability and sustainable development baked into Paris, not just the temperature component. So, what kind of questions then to ask of CDR? I'd say that whenever we're thinking about this, we really need to consider scale, whether you're talking about a field trial or a large, like we've just seen in the previous examples, large area application of, say, afforestation globally. The context, is this a single project or a single company, or is this a national plan? And the timing, is this something happening now, or is this about things happening to the end of this decade, or the national plans to the mid-century, or about impacts out to the end of the century? And I would argue that depending on that scale, context, and timing, there's different facets of sustainability or feasibility to consider. The most basic level that we've seen in the IPCC and the tables there on the right is this kind of question of how much carbon can be removed, how permanent is it, how much does it cost, and maybe who's paying for it. And then I've just shown you a set of work that really kind of expands out into kind of environmental and ecosystem services view of sustainability. But there's other work as well around water quality and quantity, biodiversity, albedo, impact on food production as well. So I wanted to just, at the back end of my 15 minutes, talk about real world feasibility, which is a focus of my research. And this on the right is an image from Jessica Jewell and Ale Chirp's paper in 23. And as they acknowledge, there's lots of versions of this idea of kind of the possibility space in blue of options or of something, climate response options, one of which could be CDR. You have a possibility space, which is a bit like the kind of potential. Then you have plausible, then you have feasible, and then probables in the middle. So it's this shift from just not just the potential, and then some limits on it, but what might be actually feasible or probable. And I'd argue that that a lot of this is about resource competition and interactions. So for afforestation, agroforestry, habitat restoration, the bioenergy component of BECCS and the application of enhanced weathering or the application of biochar, then often it's about looking at the interactions with food production and diets, land availability, water scarcity, and also biodiversity on that list. When it comes to DACs and BECCS and the mining component of enhanced weathering, then it's about geological storage, energy demand in the case of enhanced weathering and DACs, but energy system integration for BECCS. But I'd also argue then it goes beyond that. It's about infrastructure requirements and what industries, what communities and places are involved in delivering this, what monitoring, reporting, and verification is needed, what regulations, incentives, and policies are needed. And can you actually deliver something additional to what was happening anyway? So in the bottom two here, I've just given you some ideas of the kind of industries and communities involved in delivering this land-based or land-involved set of CDR methods, versus the kind of more geological storage and energy system sets of industries, communities, and actors. So I just want to step through an example with biomass energy carbon capture and storage. It features a lot in integrated assessment model scenarios of the future. It essentially is comprised of three components: feedstock, energy conversion component, and then a carbon capture and storage. The system is really complicated. One BECCS system is not like another. So the feedstock differs. It could be dedicated to energy crops. It could be residues from agriculture, whether that's wheat or sugarcane or coconut production or palm oil production. It could be residues from forestry industry, or it could be municipal solid waste. And depending on those feedstocks, you have different interactions with different systems and different sustainability limits and feasibility constraints. The energy conversion step, is it being combusted? Is it being gasified? Is it being fermented? And how does that interact with the rest of the energy system? And then on the right, the carbon capture and storage. So whether it's going into your sedimentary basins of depleted oil and gas wells and saline aquifers, or whether it's going into mineral carbonation and basalts. So I'd argue these sustainability issues depend on the specific structure of the BECCS system that you're looking at. And then that these sustainability issues interact with different components thereof, right? Whether the wider land, energy, and CO2 storage systems. So it's the feedstock that's interacting with land availability if you're doing dedicated energy crops, which therefore interacts with food production and diets and conservation and habitats. Biomass resources are required elsewhere in the energy system and for materials production. Residues depends on the forestry and agricultural availability, but residues today are used for other things. So there are competed issues there around sustainability for alternative uses. And municipal solid waste depends on national level kind of recycling, and household commercial recycling quality. The energy is really tied into the national energy system. So we see this already with first of a kind BECCS systems arising from pre-existing opportunities. So in Denmark with energy from waste, the UK in power, and then the US corn ethanol. And there's also competition from feedstock in the decarbonising it from other sectors, particularly, for example, sustainable aviation fuel for this biomass and how the biomass is used in the energy system. And finally, the carbon capture and storage is not in isolation. Industrial and fossil CCS interact with BECCS or DACs through shared transport and storage infrastructure. They all share a burden of the cost of doing this, but they're all tied together under the kind of emerging policies like emission trading schemes. So to summarize then, the sustainability limits of CDR is an active research area, but it tends to be dominated by global scale and long-term views of future emission scenarios, for example. CDR at a project scale is really complex. So I've stepped that through, for example, for BEC. So the questions asked depends on each of those components and how it interacts. The feasibility of CDR is intimately interconnected with land systems, energy systems, and the CO2 transport and storage system. And this is my personal argument. CDR is not and will not be delivered by a CDR industry. It emerges from existing industries and is modulated by those existing industries, their infrastructures and their institutions. And this sits within the bespoke national contexts in terms of natural resources, existing energy systems, and existing climate policies. In terms of the bigger picture, just to throw into the mix, large scale CDR doesn't happen without there being a value on removing and storing carbon. It doesn't just emerge. The feasibility of land-based CDR is limited by what we're seeing already in the land carbon sink response to climate change. So the impact of climate change is already impacting land carbon sinks and or food crops. That then those two things will interact on the availability of land for CDR. And there is also a broader top-level sustainability issue with the misuse or use of CDR as a reason to delay or reduce decarbonisation of the energy system. That's me done. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nem, for this very in-depth overview of sustainability and physical limits to CDR, and for introducing the framework of how we think about what's feasible, what's possible. I think that's going to be very useful. The range of options there. Next up is Dr. Rupert Stewart-Smith, Deputy Director and Senior Researcher in Climate Science and the Law at the Oxford Sustainable Law Programme. Dr. Stewart-Smith and his colleagues recently published a study on the legal guardrails for CDR in national climate plans. So he will talk today about the legal and political limits to how much carbon removal can be used in national plans and how we think about what is possible, what is feasible from a political and legal standpoint. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Olga, for that kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be virtually with you this afternoon. What I'd like to spend the next 15 minutes exploring with you is the role of carbon removal in efforts to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's important to note from the outset that carbon dioxide removal is in fact essential in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. There's no question there. But the question I'd like to explore in a little bit more detail is the role that it plays in clarifying or potentially making it slightly more challenging to understand precisely how quickly individual states or companies need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, a topic that is increasingly under scrutiny in a range of legal settings. Now, as a starting point, as you will be well aware, back in 2015, the goals of the Paris Agreement were set as, in particular, in Article 2, limiting the rising global temperatures to well below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And subsequent to the signing of the Paris Agreement, subsequent COP decisions have focused in on this 1.5 degree target, really as the principal objective of global climate action. But what does that mean for how fast the world needs to cut its greenhouse gas emissions? Well, if you open an IPCC report seeking counsel in answering that question, you'll be confronted by a figure that looks a little bit like this one. This was taken from the special report on 1.5 degrees, which is a little bit old now, but you see similar figures in AR6 and other subsequent reports. And what you see is that there are a wide range of pathways that notionally achieve the 1.5 degree target by the end of the century, but they involve a very substantial departure in the rate at which emissions are reduced in the near term. If I add on an arrow to the screen here showing the range of emission reductions or changes in emissions by 2030, what you see is that there are pathways in which emissions do not fall at all this decade, more closely resembling current practice, versus pathways in which emissions fall by at least 2/3 over the course of the 2020s. And one of the key levers explaining this large range in emission reduction pathways over the coming years is the ability to depend on carbon dioxide removal to achieve long-term climate targets. Removals are used for two purposes in these pathways. The first purpose is to offset emissions at the time that they are produced, concurrently with their emission. That is perhaps the form of removals we think about most frequently. Perhaps in the case of hard-to-abate sectors, in order to get to net zero, you need to find some way to counterbalance any emissions that are produced. And so different pathways that have different amounts of gross emissions can have different amounts of removals to balance those gross emissions out and get to net zero. But there's a second use of removals that often receives less attention. It's an equally crucial use in a world, well, especially in a world that we're rapidly entering, a world in which temperatures will soar beyond 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Removals can be used after the point of net zero to take emissions to net negative and ideally to reduce global temperatures after peak warming has been achieved. What that means is that different pathways can achieve the same long-term temperature objective while having a different level of peak warming and a different profile of temperature change over time. So carbon dioxide removal over the long term, by facilitating negative emissions, it at this point makes 1.5 degrees feasible in the long term, but it also allows for pathways that more substantially exceed 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It facilitates temperature overshoot. And when you look at the existing emission reduction targets of states, and you add them up and you work out what sort of peak warming existing targets are consistent with, you find that for the majority of states that we assessed in a paper published last year, those highest emitting countries, the 20 highest emitters in the EU, are pointed out in gold here. The majority of those states fall to the right-hand side of this vertical dotted line. In other words, the majority of states' emission targets are consistent with a peak warming of over 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels. The consequence of that is that either they have targets that are simply not consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement, or they would only become consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement if they subsequently deployed substantial amounts of carbon removal to get temperatures back down to 1.5 after a period of overshoot. All of this is to say removals are essential for achieving long-term temperature goals, but because they facilitate overshoot pathways, they come with risks as well. When we look into the detail of what states are planning on doing over the coming years, we find that dependence on carbon removal is widespread, but also that transparency around this dependence often leaves a lot to be desired. I picked out a few examples here, but others can easily be identified. In the Swiss case, for instance, they, in their nationally determined contributions and long-term low-emission development strategies submitted to the UNFCCC, they recognize they will rely heavily on BECCS and DACs to balance residual emissions at the point of net zero, but recognize that DACs could be implemented partly or exclusively at geologically suitable locations abroad, that essentially they have a lack of suitable geology to do this, and so they're going to rely on international cooperation to achieve their climate targets through their removals. In the French context, they plan to triple removals making use of the French land sink by 2050. But at the same time, they recognize that this sink has declined substantially in the last decade due to the effects of climate change, resulting in increased mortality and less growth in forests. In other words, they're going to not only have to expand their removals, they're going to actually have to push back against an existing trend of reduced carbon sequestration in the French land sink. This draws attention to another of the risks associated with depending heavily on removals, especially when the removals are not permanent, as Nem mentioned just before. In the Georgian case, they plan to rely on overseas financing for at least some of their removals. And the fact that in their long-term low-emission development strategy, they cite carbon credit market instruments, the Green Climate Fund, and the state budget as financial bases for funding the expansion of their land sink, also brings into question the credibility of some of their claims. For if they rely on international credits, then presumably they would not be able to count all of these removals towards their net zero target, placing it in jeopardy. In other words, other states are going to be paying for it, so those removals may end up on the balance sheet and the emissions balance sheet of those other states. Australia provides a contrasting another example. They refer to BECCS as an option that could be used, quote, if global developments see those technologies emerge faster than anticipated. In other words, they note that BECCS is a high-risk option to depend on substantially. But if you look beyond the sort of surface level and beyond the figures they provide, in the modeling that underlies their long-term low-emission development strategies, they actually rely heavily on BECCS, a technology or set of technologies that they recognize separately requires further technological developments and therefore is a high risk. Putting all of this together, we see that states are depending on being able to cooperate with others to deliver removals or storage abroad that increases risk to delivery. They run environmental risk through their high dependence, in some cases, on conventional carbon removal. They plan to use international credits to finance removals, which they will therefore potentially not be able to actually count towards their domestic goals. And they display a lack of transparency or adequate risk management, despite recognizing delivery concerns relating to novel carbon dioxide removal reliance. A range of risks associated with the act of doing the removals. And this is important not only for global mitigation pathways, but the potential availability of CDR and the risks of deploying it, well, that alters the range of global emission reduction pathways, but also has implications for how fast any individual country, sector, or company should be reducing their emissions. But how can we, at the global scale at least, come to a better understanding of how fast the world needs to reduce its emissions, recognizing these risks that seem to be present in existing climate targets and that seem to potentially put them, render them inconsistent with global climate goals? We need to recognize that CDR comes with substantial risks. Through facilitating overshoot pathways, CDR facilitates pathways that will generate more substantial impacts of climate change, some of which irreversible during a period of temperature overshoot. Others of those additional climate change impacts may be able to be reversed if temperatures are brought back down, but of course those impacts that have taken place during a period of overshoot will not be able to go away. In addition to the additional climate change impacts associated with overshoot pathways, the dependence on removals themselves creates further risks. Due to potential constraints associated with the delivery of removals, either related to the deployment of removals or the permanent storage of carbon removed from the atmosphere. Those pathways that depend more heavily on removals, if there's some degree of non-delivery, will lead to more carbon staying in the atmosphere and therefore temperatures being higher than they otherwise would be. So dependence on carbon removal, in addition to facilitating overshoot pathways, it creates the risk of higher warming outcomes than otherwise you would expect. And we've already heard, and I expect we'll hear more about the range of different social, environmental, and economic impacts associated with heavy dependence on removals. And yet, despite the fact that carbon removal is central to many countries' Paris plans, and despite these risks that can be noted here, states on the whole hardly disclose their dependence on removals in meeting their climate targets. And there's a problem now. Because as we've mentioned right at the start of this talk, the rate at which emissions must be reduced this decade is substantially affected by the extent to which removals can be relied upon to deliver net negative emissions in the second half of this century. Or in other words, the rate at which emissions are reduced in the coming years determines the extent to which we will be reliant on carbon removal in the decades to come. What can we do about it? In a series of analyses published with colleagues over the last few years, we've explained that due diligence under international law requires a number of things. Firstly, a minimization of the magnitude and duration of temperature overshoot, which has implications for the dependence that states can have on carbon removal to reduce temperatures after peak warming, and also provides guardrails in the nature and the extent of CDR reliance. I'll just take a moment or so to reflect in particular on the first of these. The question we asked ourselves in this work was, are pathways consistent with international law if they eventually return warming to 1.5 degrees, irrespective of the magnitude and duration of overshoot in the interim? In other words, if a court, for instance, is reviewing pathways produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a state acting in line with international law if it aligns with any one of those pathways, or is it possible to filter those pathways to a subset consistent with norms and principles of international law? Overshoot is not directly addressed in the Paris Agreement, certainly not in Article 2, which sets the temperature goal. But in more recent COP decisions from the last year and the COP30 decision, states underscored that the risks and impacts of climate change will be much lower at the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees relative to 2 degrees centigrade, and reiterated their resolve to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 and I emphasize this part, to limit both the magnitude and duration of any temperature overshoot. But what does it mean to minimize overshoot in practice? In a recent publication led by my colleague, Professor Lavani Rajamani, we explained how this temperature goal does not exist in isolation. It's a means for achieving the object and purpose of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is, to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And even if the exceedance of 1.5 degrees centigrade is only temporary, in other words, overshoot is fairly minimal and time-bound, the risks associated with it I've mentioned before, that are in some cases permanent, in other cases notionally reversible, they may still run in contrary with the purpose of the UNFCCC of preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference. Only pathways that minimize overshoot to an absolute minimum are compatible with the goals of the Paris Agreement. What in practice this means at this point is that given the paucity of pathways that actually limit warming from now on to 1.5 degrees always, about the best we can expect to do is limiting warming to about 1.7 degrees above pre-industrial levels. States need to meet their highest possible ambition. They need to reduce emissions as rapidly as they possibly can. And consistency with just any pathway that achieves the 1.5 degree target in the long term is not consistent to uphold their legal responsibilities under international law. In this paper that was published last month, we articulate the reasons for this in much greater detail, and I'd be happy to discuss that in due course. Where does that leave us? Around the world, in domestic courts and international human rights courts, legal action is attempting to concretize corporate and state mitigation duties. Claims are being made that states and companies' climate targets are inconsistent with legal obligations derived from the Paris Agreement or derived from domestic laws. But what has been less clear in these cases is precisely how fast one country or another needs to reduce its emissions and how courts should determine the answer to that question. Our work emphasizes that legal discretion is not limitless. Rapid transitions are needed in all sectors, and that courts should be able to make use of developments in interdisciplinary research that synthesizes scientific analyses with legal analyses to narrow the range of pathways consistent with legal obligations, and thus to spell out what that means for one sector or another, or one country or another. Ultimately, removals are essential for global climate goals to be met. Removing carbon from the atmosphere is an eminently good thing to be doing. But where carbon dioxide removal dependence in mitigation pathways facilitates a greater overshoot of 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels and creates a range of other risks, these risks may run contrary to norms and principles of international law. Legal analyses of the type that you can read in more detail in this recent publication, they can allow us to narrow that range of pathways to those consistent with norms and principles of international law. International law nonetheless remains not highly precise about precisely how much CDR dependence is and is not acceptable, or precisely how fast emissions must fall. But it does provide usable and useful guardrails for state action in this context that channels efforts and narrows that range of pathways to those that minimize overshoot and thus minimizes long-term dependence on removals for the purposes of going to net negative emissions. I'll conclude there. Pass back to Olga. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rupert, for bringing in a legal perspective to this conversation on feasibility of CDR and what is possible and legal. Last but not least, we have Dr. Neil Grant, from a senior expert at Climate Analytics, who's going to talk about how much CDR is included in various scenarios, including the highest possible emission scenario needed to return temperatures to well below 1.5. I think this is the point of this part of the conversation is to show that these questions on what's feasible, possible, and so on are not, idle questions. They're not abstract questions. They have direct implications for what we're looking at in the short term and in the long term. And I think bringing this into the discussion would be very useful. You have the floor.
Great, thank you so much, Olga, and thanks, Rupert and Nen, for super interesting presentations. I'm going to talk a bit more about the role of CDR in these high ambition global scenarios. So Rupert's already talked really well about this. What is the role of carbon dioxide removal? Why do we want it in the first place in these scenarios? And I think you can split it out into two different elements, which we've talked about so far. So the first element is about reaching net zero CO2 emissions. So warming will stop when we reach net zero CO2. So that's the stabilization goal. In this graph on the right, you can see a stylized mitigation pathway with emissions shown in blue above the zero line and removals shown in orange below the zero line. And you can see that there's this point where the dashed line crosses zero. This is where removals are exactly compensating for remaining CO2 emissions from fossil fuels or land use. And at that point of reaching net zero, we will stabilize warming. But the second goal, as Rupert's already mentioned, is not the Paris Agreement didn't commit us to stabilizing warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees. But in Article 4, through the commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, it actually commits us to getting to net negative CO2 emissions and bringing temperatures back down below 1.5 and towards safe levels. And this second point, where the solid line crosses the zero, this is where removals in orange balance not only CO2 emissions, which is the light blue on this graph, but total emissions, including from methane, nitrous oxide, other places. And as we reach and sustain this net negative CO2 or net zero greenhouse gas emissions, we'll bring temperatures down. And really, the choice here is, are we using carbon dioxide removal to facilitate continued emissions, continued fossil fuel use in that one point? Or are we using carbon dioxide removal to compensate for past emissions? And my argument is that if we have a small budget for CDR, we need to prioritize potentially one over the other, and particularly focus on using CDR to get temperatures back down, so getting them into that net negative zone, rather than using them to continue to compensate for fossil fuels. And that's a theme I'll develop more as we go through. First off, I also just wanted to make a very brief point about different sorts of removals. Nem was talking at the beginning about how there's a whole range of different CDR methods, and they vary across a whole range of things, including where the CO2 is stored. Now that matters because different CO2 stores may be able to store CO2 for different lengths of time. Some, you see this graph on the right, like injecting CO2 into geological formations underground can store CO2 on essentially permanent timescales. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years, while others, particularly storing CO2 in ecosystems, in new forests, in wetlands, etc., are more inherently temporary and may release that CO2 back into the atmosphere, particularly if there are wildfires or disturbances, which we know are also increasing as climate change worsens. Now, that matters because when you emit a unit of CO2 into the atmosphere, the warming effect of that CO2 is essentially permanent. 1,000 years down the line, you can still see that pulse. And so if you compensate for that permanent emission of CO2 with a temporary removal, you might for 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, be able to balance those two things out. But when that CO2 that was stored is re-emitted, then you'll be back to the worst case of as if you hadn't actually stored it in the first place. And so it's really important that when we talk about removals, we look at the different timescales over which they can remove and how that compares to the essentially permanent impact of CO2 emissions. And that highlights, not as a binary, there's many other reasons why we need to think about both technological, sort of engineered CDR, where we're injecting CO2 into geological formations. We can't rely only on that, but it highlights one key value of that permanent storage. If we think a bit more about the permanent storage, Nem's already talked a lot about this. It will be very hard to scale. We talked throughout this meeting about the legal issues, the sustainability limits, the interaction with the energy systems. CDR will be very hard to scale. One of the things that I find is that because often if we're talking about global emissions, we're talking about billions of tons of emissions right now. And that can make 1 billion seem like quite a small number. But just to give a context, if you want to get to 1 billion tons of direct air capture by 2050, that's at a relatively low level in these global scenarios. You need to take the Mammoth plant. That's the biggest direct air capture plant existing to date. You need to install 20 of those every week between now and 2050. To get to 1 billion tons of direct air capture is really, really difficult. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but it's really important to acknowledge that and not fall into the challenge of seeing 1 billion as small in comparison to global emissions. When you're starting from zero, 1 billion is a lot. And if CDR deployment is going to be limited, then that has two key implications that have already been addressed in part. First off, we need aggressive action to phase out fossil fuels. If we go back to this first chart of trying to reach net zero CO2 emissions, if we have limited CDR, we don't want to be using a lot of it to offset continued fossil fuel use. We want to be prioritizing it for this temperature reduction part. And secondly, it means that action to reduce non-CO2 emissions are also really key to reduce the need for carbon dioxide removal. There's a couple of points on the challenges with scaling CDR. How well have models captured these limits to date? So this graph on the right is showing total CDR deployment in the 1.5 compatible scenarios, which were assessed in the IPCC's last report. It came out in 2022. And if you look at the average, which is the dotted line in the middle, you see about 6 billion tons being captured and stored by 2050, and that's rising up to 15 billion tons by 2100. And if you compare those numbers to some of the sustainability and feasibility limits that we saw in the first set of slides, there's a real concern, particularly in the second half of the century, that this is breaching identified sustainability limits. It's far beyond what might be feasible. And as a result, if we use these numbers sort of without serious consideration, we can lead to misleading conclusions around how much fossil fuels we need to phase out, when we need to reach net zero, and other key milestones. So a lot of the work that I do at Climate Analytics is thinking about how do we use these scenarios more responsibly. Briefly, before we go to look at that in more detail, I want to highlight that future CDR needs is not a fixed law of thermodynamics that we can't get around. I think all of us, I think Rupert put it really well, that if we're going to meet 1.5 degrees and get back below it now, CDR is essential to some level, but the amount of CDR that we need is not fixed at the moment. That is a function of the policy choices which are made by governments around the world and the implementation that we have. So this graph on the right, this is from a paper in 2024 from Jay Furman and folks. And what they did here is they modeled two different scenarios of getting to net zero CO2 emissions. In the first one, this global carbon cap, they sort of let sectors reduce emissions as much as seemed cost effective to the model, and then wherever the model felt it would be cheaper to just use carbon dioxide removal to compensate for continued emissions, the model deployed that. As a result, by about 2050, you had almost 12 billion tons of carbon dioxide removal being deployed across regions to offset continued CO2 emissions. Then they looked at the scenario on the right, the max sectoral effort, where they really tried to squeeze fossil fuels out of the system in as many places as possible. And the important thing to highlight here is less the specific numbers, but more that they significantly reduce overall carbon dioxide removal needs. And so the level of, although we might be locked into having some level of CDR in the future, the exact scale we need is still a function of policy choices. Those are policy choices about how much we act to reduce residual emissions. And those are also policy actions which act to try and limit the extent of overshoot. This is another paper from Ruben Prutz and colleagues from 2023, which looked at the relationship between every 0.1 degree of increased overshoot of 1.5 degrees and how much additional CDR scenarios often deploy to get back down below 1.5. And they found that, perhaps unsurprisingly, the more you overshoot, the more CDR you need, up to an additional 200 billion tons of removals per 0.1 degree of increment. And thinking back to Rupert's presentation, he was showing that excellent work that shows that actually scenarios with minimum overshoot have the greatest legal compatibility with the Paris Agreement. You could reverse that here and say, therefore, scenarios which are trying to minimize, strictly limit CDR deployment are also, therefore, more compatible with the Paris Agreement's limits. I'm going to switch focus now. That's a bit of an overview of some of the sort of challenges that global scenarios often face with CDR. I'm going to talk a bit now in my last 5 minutes about the role of CDR in a new scenario that we released as Climate Analytics last year called the highest possible ambition scenario. First off, just to introduce this scenario, what were we doing? We're looking at the issue of 1.5 degrees, overshoot, and how we can get temperatures back below 1.5. And the main problem that we were trying to solve is that all of these scenarios that I showed you earlier in our slides that we've been talking about today, they're outdated. Most of them assume that action started at the beginning of 2020, and we had the whole of this critical decade of the 2020s to reduce emissions by about 40 to 50%. Here we are at the beginning of 2026, and emissions have grown in that first half of the decade. And that has really significant implications for how fast we can reduce emissions by 2030, what level of overshoot we're locked into, and how fast we can get back below 1.5 degrees. And that's what this scenario was looking at. And we'll talk now about the role of CDR in this scenario. So first off, just to give you a bit of a further picture of this scenario, if we look on the left-hand panel here, you have global emissions. In green are the 1.5 compatible scenarios which were assessed in the last IPCC report. And then blue is the highest possible ambition scenario. As you can see, it accounts for the fact that we've really squandered this decade in the 2020s, and we're not going to be able to reduce emissions by 40 to 50% by 2030. And as a result, we're going to have to play catch up later in the century to account for that delay in action. And if you look at the graph on the right, this is showing global temperatures, with the red envelope being from the IPCC scenarios and blue being this new highest possible ambition scenario. And what we found was that really, starting from now, if the world acts in line with the highest possible ambition, the lowest that we could get temperatures is about 1.7 degrees in 2050. But that by 2100, if we scale CDR, action on methane, fossil phase out, a few different levers, we can still get temperatures back below 1.5 degrees. What's the role of CDR in this scenario? Well, it's about reaching net zero CO2 to stop warming, and it's about reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions to start bringing warming back down. And what we found is that actually, because of the delay of the last 5 years and insufficient action, the dates of net zero that we need to be targeting at the global level need to be earlier now than they were 5 years ago, which is what this graph on the right shows. And that means that CDR is a necessity in this scenario, not a choice, but we can still try and control the level of CDR deployment that we need. So in the highest possible ambition scenario, if you look at total CDR deployment, so this graph on the right is showing how much CO2 is removed from three main methods for carbon dioxide removal. So that's planting trees first, then bioenergy with CCS in the middle, and then direct air capture to the right. And you can see the deployment in the highest possible ambition scenario in blue diamonds. And I guess the key point I wanted to make here is that we really tried to limit the deployment of the CDR here to low levels. We have some of the lowest levels of bioenergy deployment out of any scenario in the literature. But it is still a huge amount to get up to, 3 gigatons of BECCS, 3 gigatons of DAC by 2050. That will take unprecedented effort to scale very bulky, complex engineering technologies. I will just come into land now with the last couple of thoughts. One thought is about the relationship between carbon dioxide removal and a fossil phase out. So as you saw in the last slide, there's less CDR in this highest possible ambition scenario than there is in many IPCC scenarios. And yet we have higher overshoot, but still get back down. How do we manage that? In part, it's about pushing much harder on the fossil phase out side of things. So you can see here, this graph on the right, this is total fossil fuel use in the highest possible ambition scenario. And you can see that we reach net zero CO2 around 2045 in our scenario. At that point, there's CDR, which is compensating for about 100 exajoules, about 20% of current fossil fuel demand is still existing and being compensated for with CDR. But between 2045 and 2070, we phase out that fossil fuel demand. And that means all of that CDR, which was being used to offset and compensate for fossil fuel use, can then be transitioned to driving temperature reductions. As we overshoot 1.5 degrees, I would argue that the need for a fossil phase out actually grows rather than weakens, because that can ensure that most carbon removals are prioritized for getting temperatures back below 1.5 degrees rather than compensating for continued fossil fuel use. And so I think one concept that we need to really wrestle with more as a community, from journalists through to academics, is the difference between net zero and real zero. Where are we compensating for continued emissions versus where are we eliminating emissions? Very last point, what if CDR fails to scale? I am much more worried in the real world that we won't get any CDR at all than that we'll smash past sustainability limits. I think we really need to think about sustainability limits in terms of the story we tell about CDR. But in the real world, it's going to be very hard to scale this. I'm not particularly worried we are going to get beyond 3 gigatons of BECCS by 2050. We did a bit of a test in our analysis of what happens if we actually only got to that 1 billion tons of BECCS and 1 billion tons of DACs by 2050 and never were able to scale beyond that. And we found that you can still limit temperatures to below 1.5 degrees. So we need CDR to get temperatures below 1.5, but we can still get below with more moderate CDR, as long as we also underpin that with a fossil phase out and ambitious action on other levers. I will pause there because I've already used more than my 15-minute slot. Apologies. Thanks very much. Back to you, Olga.
Thanks so much, Neil, and thanks everyone for these fascinating presentations. Really interesting. If we do have a couple of minutes left for questions, as the moderator, I will pose my question to all three of you. It's going to be a bit of a lightning round situation. And if anyone has other questions, please post them in the chat. I will also read them out. My question to you all is, when you happen to read stories by journalists about CDR, so general reporting, science reporting, what is the one thing you wish they would have done differently? It could be as tiny as you want, but it could be a pet peeve of yours, something that always triggers your attention. What should journalists do differently in your opinion? And I'll start with them, if I may.
Sure, thanks. I get the least time to think about an answer. I don't know. I mean, the solutionism style always annoys me, but that's just a style of writing. Like, is this a fix too? And then obviously it isn't. But that's fine. It's a way to hook people in to read the start of the article. I acknowledge that. I think, yeah, I think falling for the hype. I think sometimes, particularly with the engineered CDR, I think falling for the over-promising, like with all the hydrogen hype, it's fairly obvious to see that this is like, yeah, we need to scale the vested interests that are championing certain approaches and the journalists who fail to state the obvious there, or oppose it in a way that subtly allows the reader to state the obvious there, or to query it. And then I guess, I mean, it's boring and it's not what anyone wants to hear, but you need to reduce your emissions. Basically, what Rupert and Neil have just stepped through. Like, and so do you want to say it because it's dull, but it's like, but it is the actual point you get to, right? So that kind of, yeah. I think, what makes stuff that people will click on and read is different to the actual take-home message. So, I've seen a range of journalists do that well to less well. And so, but I acknowledge that it's tricky to get readers to listen and to care and to make it related. And I think it's very hard. The stuff that Rupert and Neil have been focused on in that kind of longer, bigger picture is really abstract from everyday life. And so that is very hard because as soon as you want to make the story relational to the reader, right? It doesn't work when you're talking about texts that don't really exist yet, or you end up with loads of pictures of the Mammoth Project, like Neil mentioned, and I had on my slides. Do you know what I mean? Like, because unfortunately there is a disconnect between that. It's not very, it isn't very relatable. So someone tries to relate it, and then that often falls. But I don't think there's a better way of doing that. So again, I just acknowledge the challenge when a journalist is trying to write about something that's so abstract and different and further down the line. Is that all right? Goes this short anyway.
Thanks. I mean, in a way, we're trying to figure out a better way to write about this stuff throughout the year with these events, when we kind of interrogate different things that people point out and different approaches to writing this story. Thanks again, Rupert. Go ahead.
For me, the key objective has to be to find a balanced narrative. Removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it permanently is an eminently good thing to be doing. Depending too much on it as a way to reduce climate ambition in the near term is a bad thing. But so often I see a focus on one or the other. What we need is a way to communicate in a balanced way that carbon dioxide removal is necessary, it's important. When done well, it's an important component of mitigation. When used as an excuse to postpone mitigation action, or to avoid making some of the more difficult decisions that we do need to make in climate mitigation, then it can be unhelpful. And this is not only an issue for journalists, I think it's an issue across political advocacy within climate policy, in the courts as well. It's an issue that I see many have found it difficult to find sort of adequately balanced and sophisticated narratives on this, tending to either say it's a good thing or a bad thing. So I think we need phrasing that allows us to communicate accurately on its role in climate change mitigation, which is very important. It is unavoidable, but comes with risks as well.
Thanks. And finally, Neil, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to add to the list of sort of, yeah, can we have more nuance, which I appreciate is very hard actually in the current media environment and what stories work. But I think for me, statements of scenarios show we need X amount of gigatons of carbon removal. I think it's really helpful to break that down into maybe two separate statements. One, if we want to get below 1.5 degrees, we need some level of CDR. That's fine. But then to try and help people understand that there is a choice still about how much CDR we need, and we can limit it to the lowest level through tackling hard to abate sectors, phasing out fossil fuels, action on methane, other things like this. I see often, people using this sort of statement. Scenarios say we need 10 billion tons of CDR to be, used to motivate sometimes, I think, badly targeted CDR ventures, investments in fossil fuels, a whole range of other things. These scenarios are being weaponized sometimes for dangerous purposes. And I think sort of broad brush statements like we need X from scenarios. Scenarios are not the laws of thermodynamics. They're messy, multi-contingent stories, and trying to slightly break that open in reporting, I think, is really useful.
Thanks, everyone. So I think we have avoiding hype, offering more balance and a balanced story, and more nuance, which I think is not dissimilar to a lot of other science journalist stories that are high on everyone's agenda right now. Thanks again for taking the time to speak to us today. Thanks for sticking a bit over time. Please follow the EFSJ social media and subscribe to this newsletter to see updates about future events. And obviously this one it was recorded and will be posted on the website as well. And stay tuned for more events in the series and more conversations on solutions and how they get reported on by science journalists. Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.